Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Acadia Brown Bag presentation. Our speaker today is Dr. Richard Kuntner. He is currently in Switzerland. He is a rural engineer, which is a new term for me. And in Central Europe, that is something akin to a civil or environmental engineer with a focus on rural and protected areas. He's worked in a number of countries with a lot of interest on water and watershed issues. And back in 2019, so 3 years ago, he was at Acadia in Bar Harbor, Maine, to do a study of the Cromwell Brook watershed, which is one of the main watersheds in the east side of the park that has a stream that flows right into Bar Harbor. And that study focused on flood risk assessment and potential mitigation. So some of you may know Dr. Kuntner already from his work at that time. Since then, he's done work in other countries, and he has kindly offered to speak to us about his experiences working in Germany and in Austria at 2 national parks. And I'm going to mispronounce this. He taught me how to pronounce this right, and I've already forgotten, but I think it's Gesuse in Austria, which is an alpine gorge. And then the Bavarian forest, which is more of a gently rolling hill forested environment in Bavaria. So without any further ado, I'll turn things over to Richard Kuntner. Richard, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Tim, for this kind introduction. I'm going to talk about 2 national parks in Central Europe. And for those who don't know me, I'm a hydrologist with an engineering background. I'm a specialist in flood and debris flow risk mitigation analysis. I'm shifting a little more towards restoration of rivers and watersheds. I've been working 15 plus years for consultants, NGOs, and I also did an MBA and a CS in development cooperation. So from these dots, I don't want to go into detail, but I think 3 dots you have to keep in mind. The dot show where I've been working, the colored ones are important. So if you can see, and this will also, this color logic will follow through my presentation. So everything which is yellow is Acadia, light green is Gesäuse, that's how I pronounce it. And then we have a dark green, which is the Bavarian forest. So everything, as you mentioned, Tim, started with me being spending 3 months at Acadia National Park. It was a great time. I did a flood risk analysis, and I really realized that restoring and watershed analysis is something in this context is something I'd like to do more. And therefore, I went to 2 different parks in Central Europe and did similar studies, more concentrated on restoration. Okay, before starting here, I think one thing is very important. It is all that I'm saying is my personal impressions. I'm not speaking for the park, so I'm not in the park. I'm not a member of the park. Okay, I really was welcomed everywhere, but I'm not a member, so I can't speak for them. And as I'm also not a member, I'm not aware of the whole park, so I'm probably just showing a little bit the tip of the iceberg. And I'm also concentrating, shedding light on certain elements, not on everything. And of course, I have my special focus or my lenses, which are a little bit blue, coming from the from river restoration. So, okay, the agenda of today's my presentation will be the introduction. So I already did it. As the next thing, I'll talk about geography and history of the parks, of those 2 parks. I'll briefly introduce my projects, and then I'll show a little bit what are the key topics of the park, because I think that's what might interest you coming from the park, which are key topics in other parks, which are similarities, which are different. And from these key topics, I'll shed a light on selected specific areas. And so here, this is probably, you know, this lamp from some comic. It is an adaptation from there. So if you see this lamp, I'll show some light on a specific element, and I want you to record, or especially keep this in mind what I'm saying here. And the red one is if I have some small story to tell. Okay, so now let's jump over the ocean and the middle of Austria and to the Gesuse National Park. So the Gesäuse National Park is basically a part of the Enns River watershed. This is the Enns River. It's tributary of the Danube. And it is basically the very hilly part. It is an alpine section of the Enns River catchment. Now you may ask, Gesäuse, what does this mean? Even in Germany, people, if I say this to people, they start smiling a little bit because it's not a very general term. It comes from the verb sausen, which could be translated with whistle, roaring, thundering, swooshing. So it's basically a part of the river where we have a higher slope, and therefore we have the water has more turbulence, and the sound it produces is basically this sausen. But before we concentrate on this section on the Gesäuse, I would like to zoom up a little bit and go to the Enns River, because the upstream part of the Enns River has quite some influence on this section of the Enns, or the Gesäuse. So the Enns River, as I said, is a tributary of the Danube. It is basically running in a alluvial valley. On the north, we have a calcareous Alp. On the south, we have a metamorphic zone. And in the Gesäuse, it breaks through the calcareous Alps, and therefore it is a little bit like a gorge. An important point, and please keep also some of this in mind, is that since 1930, the river has been significantly modified. It has been shortened by nearly 90 kilometers, which also had some influence on the groundwater. We have 4 power stations, which were built, some upstream, some downstream, which has the influence on the Gesäuse that we have artificial daily flow fluctuations and the reservoir flashings with a fine sediment input. I think this is this point I will mention again, because this has a lot of influence on all the restoration measures. So, okay, now let's zoom into the Gesäuse. The Gesäuse, if you're a stargazing addict, or if you like this, I think then at least if you live in Central Europe, you must come here once in lifetime, because it is one of the darkest places in Central Europe and you have excellent view of stars. In addition, it is a part of the Natura 2000, which is the European network of protected areas. It is, because of this here, it is a famous rafting destination. And you also have a lot of tributaries with high sediment transport rates. So now, if you concentrate a little bit more on this river valley and look at it, what is the historical, what's the history in terms of human use? So this valley here, you can see the first impression you get has been used since late Middle Ages as agricultural use and forestry, but it wasn't used very intensively. And this changed with the railway lane, with the construction of this railway line. And because at that time, this construction required removal of much material, and it was a strong it was the first strong human influence in this catchment. The other one was, of course, the road improvement, which led to a road which is now an important east-west axis. So you can see the valley is also an important traffic axis through the Alps. Nevertheless, it is, and please keep this in mind because I will mention it later as well, it is still has the impression that it is a natural river section because the river channel itself hasn't been modified much, even through those 2 construction sites. Now, the national park first ideas came up in the 80s, and then in 96 it became serious. We had a 6-year planning period, and 2002 the park was created. In 2003 it became USCN accredited. And now the park has 30 years to restore 75% of the area to as natural as possible. After this 30 years, 75% of the area shouldn't be touched anymore. And the instrument to do this, financing instrument, is the EC Life projects. For those who don't know them, they are basically the main EC financing instrument for nature restoration projects. And here, a small lamp, I think, even if I was there, I was told, you know, people still today, after 20 years, aren't very happy about the park. So it is still, you have still some opposition. It is declining, but nevertheless, because before people were allowed to go wherever they wanted. They could hunt, they could collect berries, they could walk wherever they liked. And now with the park, they aren't allowed to leave. There are certain trails they can use, others they are not. And if they don't, they're fine. So this, of course, if you are used to, as a small child, to walk wherever you like, this is a little bit of a problem, can be. And this is something a key element I will discuss later. So now some impressions. This is just upstream of this gorge here. This is the gorge, and this is the part where the river used to meander and build some lakes. And now we come closer to the gorge. Here we see the gorge entrance. We are in the gorge, and here we climb of one of those, not exactly here because I'm not, I can't, this is too steep for me, but then it is somewhere here. And you can see here we have a lot of sediment transport which is going on. There's a lot of sediment going into these rivers. Okay, so now after Austria, we travel to Germany, not far, some 300 kilometers north, to the Bavarian forest, which got its name from also a mountain chain, but a much lower mountain chain, which is called the Bavarian forest. And we can see here it is at the eastmost border of the Bavarian forest and also of Germany, at the border to the Czech Republic. And what you can see here, this is the Bavarian Forest National Park. Here, exactly at the border, we have the Czech pendant, which is the Šumava National Park, and together they are 800 square kilometers, a landscape of more or less natural forests. And just here, a small lamp. This is a touristic map, and you can see here all these mountains here are somehow touristic attractions and also attractions for the locals. And this will keep this in mind because I will mention this later on. Okay, so some key characteristics of the Bavarian forest, as I mentioned, low mountain range. First settlement was in the 8th century because that time it was still a very rough forest, so people didn't go much into the forest. The colonizers started in the 8th century. Then some decades later, the kings realized now this forest, we could make better use of it. So they introduced glass manufacturing. 3 centuries later, in the south, the big cities started to develop, so they needed some firewood, and this was, of course, an excellent opportunity to better use the forest. And this was the beginning of the log driving period, because how to get the forest to the cities, you use the water. And within the next 200 years, the log driving infrastructure was systematically expanded, and the transport of firewood and wood to the cities continued, but with the end of the 18th century, log driving was step by step replaced by railways, and after World War II by road transportation, which is still, of course, today the dominant way of transporting wood. And today, glass manufacturing is declining. Forestry is still a very important sector, but tourist is, I would say, one of the main pillars. And also the Park Authority is a major employer and not to underestimate. So this is just a small parenthesis I'm opening to show you what this log driving infrastructure looks like. Probably you're used to this kind of transporting wood, but this is a smaller scale. And so in order to make the rivers and creeks, so you could transport logs, you had to armor them. Here you see a way of armoring them with some trunks, and then you have some nails the nails you put perpendicular into the slopes, or you used some rocks, like we can see here a little bit. And of course, all the rocks in the channel were put on the sides in order to make it easier for the trunks to cross. And another central element are dams. And those dams were built in order to create artificial floods to transport the trunks and not to be dependent on the weather. Okay, and now to national park. I think the national park ideas, it was somehow the idea grow between 1910 and 70, and in 70 it became reality. But as you can see, also here it had the birth of this national park wasn't without big debates, and still today you have people which aren't that happy with the park for the reason I mentioned earlier. And the park was inaugurated in 1970, expanded in 79, and in 22, this was somehow connected to the 50-year anniversary. So they got a present of 6 square kilometers they could add, but this is still in process, to adding this part of the park to the park. Okay, so here's some images. You see what I said, it's like a hilly area, and it's like a sea of trees. And this is one of those touristic places where you can go. Here, geologists, please don't ask me why you have all this rock formations here. There, I would have to dig deeper in order to, but I can get you the answer if you really want it. And here, this is the next hill, which is also, and I think here, that's why I put the lamp here. 20 years ago, this was completely covered by forest. Then we had the bark beetle, and then everything looked like this without all of the small trees. And now, after 20 years, it starts looking quite nice again. Then what you also have is some meadows, some alpine meadows, which are, of course, maintained. Otherwise, they would be completely grown over by forest. Okay, so now let's just a few key elements of the park. You see, the Gesäuse is a smaller park. It's half the size of Bavarian forest. It is a small park, 15 permanent staff. But on the other hand, it has the advantage that basically every day, or not every day, every second day I had lunch with a group composed of the superintendent, his the head of the natural conservation unit. And so I learned a lot about the park just by being part of their lunch team. In this park, of course, this is much more difficult. You have in total up to 300 people if everyone is there. And you have also here voluntary, probably the park is too small to have a volunteer program. Here they have volunteer programs, which is somehow not exactly the same as in the US, but they have rangers here. Again, they have rangers. Probably the interesting thing is that here the rangers are freelance. This is to exactly because they are cheaper than if you have to hire them. And talking about money, this park is a flagship project of Bavaria, and therefore, and it is an agency of the Bavarian ministry, and therefore money is always a problem, of course, but it is probably less a problem than it is in this park. And yeah, and as I said, it is an agency, whereas here it is a special structure. It is a private structure, limited. It's compared to a limited liability company, and 50% owned by the province and 50% by the federation. Okay, so now let's jump to my project. In the Gesäuse, I had a look at the at this river section. I looked, is there some potential to revitalize? Because this is the only section which is not influenced by hydropower. And what I did, I spent a lot of time hiking here and there, and I looked at it. And if you look at this picture, you think, wow, this looks nice. This looks so terrific, natural. But of course, this was Photoshop, which helped a little bit, not my Photoshop, but a professional's Photoshop. But even when walking there, I realized, where is this natural or not? So especially here, I spent a lot of time walking here. Is this natural? And only looking at aerial picture, I realized, no, this is not ritual. This is not. It has been modified. In the 50s, the river used to run here. And in the 70s, all this area was filled up. But today, it looks quite natural. The same thing is here. Here also, only when looking at it at a pictures, you realize that this kind of line can't be natural. So here again, the river has been moved. And by looking at this aerial pictures, I could detect two sections where the river channel has been relocated. Now, these results will be eventually considered in one of Life Easy project, which aims at restoring 7 rivers in Austria, including the Enns River. But of course, even if we restore this area, the major problem we have in this section is really the influence by hydropower, as I said, the sediments and the high fluctuation of water level, which is very difficult for some habitats for fish. And that's why the fish population is rather limited in this Enns River, despite the fact that this section is quite natural. In Bavaria, I also spent a lot of time hiking, even more, and I had a look at 14 river sections. They were much smaller, and the idea was that I look at them from an engineering point of view, but I soon realized river engineering is seldom the point here. It is often more to all the conditions imposed by different stakeholders you have to take into consideration, which will then decide what you can do, how much restoration is possible. And I'm a little bit proud of it. While walking here in this river, there was a road, this road was being renovated. So I thought to myself, you know, here, there's this river just next to it. So you have all the machinery. Why don't you use the machinery to do at the same time the restoration of this river as well? And in the end, I could even convince the, it took a while, but then I could convince the superintendent that this is a good idea. And hopefully, so we'll have this part of the road restored in autumn. Of course, it's not that easy as I'm explaining it now. It takes a lot of discussions with all the people involved, but nevertheless, I think I put this idea on the table that why, if you have here construction, why don't you use the synergies to restore this as well? Okay, so as I said, I realized the problem in this whole restoration are the stakeholders. So problem, or let's say now the challenge, or the challenge, the positive thing you have to consider and to work with. And so what I did, I had a look at the stakeholders, and then based on this stakeholder analysis, let's say we did a restoration prioritization scheme. And basically this scheme is not, I didn't invent it. It is just, I just took all the information from the different collaborators in the park and I put it on paper. So basically I just asked them a lot of questions. What came out is this, it's not that I invented this logic. I just collected what was existing. But I don't want to enter now, I just showed you a little bit what I did. And now I want to zoom out again. And I want to show you, as I said, I want to talk about my impression, not the technicalities of what I did there. So I want to show you from all the key topics of the parks, which one was I involved in? What did I learn about all these parks, all different aspects of the parks? As I understand, you in the audience, there are people from very different disciplines in the park. So what I did, I had a look at the management plans of both national parks, and I looked which are the main topics, and I tried to understand which topics while working there, I was involved in. Of course, to say here, the main topics of this management plan are given by IUCN, but every park is different, so every park has a little bit of different focus. And now what I'm going to talk about is, I'm not going to introduce all of them, but I'm talking a little bit about restoration, which is in this sector on the both parks. Then I'll mention one thing is infrastructure, which is quite an important point I was involved in at Gesäuse. Then research is very important, especially in this park. And the key element is really this one, integration to region and collaboration with the context, which in my opinion is a key element for both parks. So now I'm going to dive or to shed some light on these elements, but as you can see here from the dots, I think I'm not a specialist of all this, and in this short time I can just show very small elements which hopefully give you a little bit of an idea in which direction it can go. Okay, so restoration for me, we had, while this is the river you have seen before, And when I suggested this, we had very interesting discussions, because basically it is in the area which is more than 30 years in IUCN, so you shouldn't touch it anymore. But you can't, how can you restore this if you don't touch these trees? Because these trees, they were part of the armoring, and if you don't remove them, you can see it can, yeah, after a certain while they will fall, and then you have some natural evolution. But if you really want to get this a little bit quicker, then you have to intervene. So this is a very interesting conflict you have here, the same as here. Basically this you remember, this is the bark beetle. So here, the local population, if they saw this, for them, this was a catastrophe. It's like if you cut, I don't know, let's say Matterhorn, Switzerland, or one of those iconic places people are connected to. If it is deforested, for them, it's not possible. So the park learned something, and they said, okay, we can't, despite the fact that it is in the center of the park, we can't accept this in that way anymore. So we have to dampening this a little bit, and to make it, to sell it a little bit soft to the population. So we have to make measures. Then this, if the forest is dying, that it goes slower and doesn't go in one, let's say in half a year, all the forest is killed. So I think this was a very interesting discussion. The next thing, as I mentioned, are the stakeholders. So I learned, of course, national parks, you always have the green elements, which are key elements, no doubt. But I learned that it's not just about, I thought, okay, we address this, it's technical, it's technicality, we have just solved the problem, but that's not the case. You have a lot of neighbors and general public to consider, which are key, because if they are not happy with what they're doing, then they are voters. So they vote politicians which are against this one. And then in the end, if they vote certain politicians, then the park gets a problem because there's no funding. So I think that's why these stakeholders must be taken to the boat. And okay, here perhaps just one bracket comment. You can see if I use those two colors at the same sentence, it means it's valid for both parks. Okay, so let's say the local population is a key stakeholder for both parks, and the parks are very well aware of this. So in the national park plan of the Bavarian forest, national park is even said that the national park must be a driving force for tourism, as tourism is an important pillar. And as I mentioned before, no large-scale areas where forest dies. In the Gesäuse, these goals, I think they are really interesting. They say a lot. So they want that 75% of the local population is in favor of the park. And another goal is that 1/3 of all students of the province have visited the park at least once during their school time. I think this is 4,000 students a year. So you see, the parks are really aware of this key stakeholder. And then, of course, you have the other stakeholders, which are more industrial, which are larger, but nevertheless also have a lot of political power. And you don't want these beetle infections to be to infect industrial forests. And another thing is water rights. I learned in hydropower, okay, water rights, I know this from Swiss Alps, don't touch them. They are very critical. It's the same here. You can't touch them, even if in restoration, you can't touch them. Only if you have a concession renewal, then eventually there is some marge de maneuver, but otherwise it's very difficult. And of course, in the case of the Gesäuse, the railway line, don't touch it. It is or railway, it connects this extraction site to a processing site. And so this railway has to run whatever happens. Other stakeholders, for the local population, what's an important point is education. So in both parks, education plays a key role. So in the Gesäuse, it's the schools, and in Bavarian forest, it's schools and use in general. And here's a small funny detail. As the PR manager of Gesäuse loves photography, he has a small photography school in here, so that the Gesäuse offers photography classes, and of course linked to this stargazing. But I think that's a funny element to see what the parks, what kind of services they offer. And another point for those two elements is recreation. Recreation is explicitly listed in the Park of Bavarian Forest, but recreation should always be connected to education, and both parks have quite an impressive infrastructure. So they have adventure, recreation, education infrastructure. It means education centers, which are really nice, conference centers, restaurant, hiking, cycling, ski trails, fixed rope routes, river rafting, boat launching sites in the case of the Gesäuse. And that's also something you have to consider when you restore, because I had some rivers and I said, yeah, why don't we remove these trails? It's no problem. This would be great. We would have the whole river segment. We would have a whole valley for the river, but this is very difficult. It's very political. We said this to the superintendent, but he said, "Oh, don't! I in my time won't touch this anymore because this is too political. That will be the next superintendent can try to do this." And last but not least, historic preservation. Of course, this might look nice. This might look from an ecological point, it may be a catastrophe. But if you look at that from a lens from a historic preservation person, these are historic monuments you have to keep. So also those guys, they have some power and they have some veto power. And as I've said, important is for all them to enter the park, you must have some access. You have to make it possible for people to access nature. So in the case of the Gesäuse, it's a little bit different because already the Gesäuse per se is some east-west transport access. So you can't close the railway lane. This is completely possible. And even the road is important. You can reduce the traffic, but you can't completely cut it down. But what the park is trying now is to implement the traffic concept with park and limited park spaces, park and ride services. And I think there's two small stories. I also spent some 20 hours counting the traffic here somewhere on a rock, and I think it was that much traffic that I didn't manage to note everything I should have noted. I think in some hours I counted about 60% of all the cars passing because there were that much. And the motorcycles, the funny thing is they're very loud. And of course for them it's funny to run here because it is curved so they can accelerate. But there we had one German tourist. He was sitting here on the top and he was so annoyed by this noise that he wrote a letter to the ministry in Vienna and complained. And eventually this is a result of this, I don't know. In the Bavarian forest, there's already some park and ride service well established. So this bus line is one of 3 bus lines from a central park and ride place going to different sites. But there's still in the newer part, this isn't yet that well established. So this is something the park will establish. And last point, monitoring and research. I think what you can say, the Bavarian Forest is really a research hub. Just the 3 employees of the park are university professors, and within the last 20 years, they formed 30 to 40 PhD students. I think this speaks for itself, and they have a large staff just for a maintenance operation of their hydrological monitoring networking, and that's why they produce a lot of high-ranking basic research tools and management tools for forest, nature protection, and park management. But of course, this is because it has that much money and is a key central hub of, it is a flagship project of the Bavarian province. But I think also Gesäuse is doing a great job in research. They're working a lot with universities, Austrian universities, and both parks, of course, research and monitor are a key element because they are IUCN certified and because of Natura 2000. And research has 2 main lines. One is park management, and the other one is understanding of ecosystems. Park management ranges from visitor management, education, ecosystem. In the case of the Gesäuse, it's also sediment transport, which is last topic in Bavarian forest. And of course, it was also research or more monitoring should help to evaluate the efficiency and correct management measures, so for them to become more efficient. And here, in the case of the Bavarian forest, they have even a guiding team in their research, which is parameters controlling the development of natural forests. And I think with this, I'm coming to my final remark. Those of you who assisted my final presentation at Acadia, where I presented my results from the flood study, they eventually remember the sentence where I really expressed my impression that how I was impressed by all of the people working there, their devotion to a mission and what they did. I think I was deeply impressed how they managed this park and how they are to this park. And I must say, I met a similar devotion connection to the parks, and I think working in such an environment can be rewarding and fulfilling despite all the hurdles and challenges of the daily routine you have everywhere. Okay, and I think with this, I'm coming to the end. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, if there are any question or information you want to have, feel free to contact me and also to have a look at my ResearchGate page. And with this, I give you the word back, Tim.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. That was a fascinating presentation. And I, for one, am struck that I feel like we've just seen two parks that have so much in common with Acadia in Central Europe that these could almost be sister parks. And pretty much every topic you've touched on are things that are dealt with in this park, as you well know. I'd like to open this up for a moderated Q&A session. If you have a question or a comment for Richard, please raise your hand on the, use the raise hand icon, and we will, I will ask you to unmute and you can ask your question. So questions for Richard.
This is Bob Freitag from the University of Washington. Richard, have you found any experience with mass modes of transportation to sensitive areas, the uses of bus and trains to protect very sensitive ecosystems, and acceptance with that?
I didn't quite understand. So you have whether buses are accepted in order to protect this ecosystem. So people don't use their cars because they think that would be a way to protect the ecosystem. Did I get this point correctly?
Yes.
I think, this is even, we talked about in Gesäuse, and people are very much self-centered. It depends on the service you offer them. You have to offer them really a service where they can drop out of their car and just fall into the bus, and the bus goes exactly to the place where they can fall out. I think you have to tailor it and make it really interesting for them, and then it works. But otherwise, people still love their car, and it's difficult to convince them. Especially, that's why in the Gesäuse they are really limiting the number, because when I was there, you had cars everywhere.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Richard, I assume that when you were in Acadia a couple of years ago, you saw the Island Explorer bus system that operated around the park, which is very heavily used. And I think, as I understand it, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but the use of that is really limited only by the number of buses and number of drivers and the logistics of scheduling them. There's still a vast majority of visitors who drive their own personal cars, but it is a very effective. Oh, we have a question about electric motorcycles. And does that include e-bikes, Richard? I'm sorry, Robert.
Yeah, we had some e-bikes. I used one. So basically I got one, and the parks in Gesäuse, they rent some. And the Gesäuse, in both cases, the problem is now in the Bavarian forest, you have quite a nice cycle road. You have it, but the distances are quite big. So depending on what you want to do, you have to run quite big distances. But there you can rent, you have the rent infrastructure, and you have a cycle pass infrastructure. In the Bavarian forest, you have it. In the case of the Gesäuse, given due to the topography, it's quite difficult. They wanted to make a crossing another along this in this gorge, but just to construct such a cycle pass is quite expensive. And they are planning it, they're discussing about this, but it isn't so far yet. And talking about Acadia, and I remember at 2019 when I was there, I think there was this traffic concept which was discussed, and I was there in May, a weekend in May, and then if you go to Cadillac Mountain, it was incredible, just one car after the other. So, but I think if I just heard about the Gesäuse, limiting the number of park spaces in Acadia, I think this would be a revolution. I assume this would be completely just the idea that if you are in, let's say, in Acadia, you come up with the idea we have a number of park spaces, and if they are empty, you can't park in the park anymore. I don't know whether this idea could work, but I think this would be completely out of question. I don't know whether this could be something. I think this would be interesting to discuss.
Other questions or comments for Richard? Please feel free to unmute and make your comments.
This is Becca Stanley with Friends of Acadia, and just going off your point about the experiment related to parking, I think Rocky Mountain tried that system-wide, a reservation system, and what happened was their popular area, I think it's called Bear Creek, filled up, and the rest of the park was practically empty. And they didn't monitor every single parking spot, but it was an interesting case study in understanding habits of people and where they go and why they go there. And yeah, just something to look into about their reservation system. But yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you. And I think another point, if you're talking about, I was in Acadia, I was incredibly impressed by this whole trail system you have there. And this, if you have this document, I think 160 pages, I don't know, it's a marvelous book. And I think this is different in those two parks. You don't have, I think, okay, probably Acadia is a little bit special due to Rockefeller and all what he did, all this carriage road. Probably this is something which is different in the other parks. And I talked to them, and I even gave them this park and told them, look here, you have an excellent, it's like a Bible of trail construction. It is. I'm a really big fan of this book, but I think this is a little bit different. And I think that's an element in Acadia you don't have in this parks, which is this Rockefeller, I would call it I don't know how to call it, but let's call this element Rockefeller, I don't know how to say it. And I think that's something I was very much impressed while at Acadia.
Sort of a Rockefeller influenced approach to roads. Yeah. Since we just heard from Becca, who's with Friends of Acadia, that's a major philanthropic partner of the park, and most U.S. national parks have some sort of partner that does some fundraising as well as advocacy and supports conservation and education in the parks. And is that true there? Do the parks have kind of a designated philanthropic partner that plays an important role in the community and raising awareness and interest and also raising funds?
I'm not aware of, let's say, like partners of Gesäuse or partners of the Bavarian forest. I'm not aware of this. Mm-hmm. Eventually it exists, but I'm not aware of. But I can check this. If this is a question, I could check it. And I think another point, which is what I said, is volunteering. I think this is something probably, even if you talk about Europe and US in general, I think US, not just in parks, this volunteering idea is it's stronger than it is in Europe, I think. This is something which is also, I realized in Acadia, volunteers are really important. And in the Bavarian forest, it was too large, so I couldn't really talk to them. And they have some volunteer programs, but I think it's different. And I don't think they have like a volunteer, someone in charge of all the volunteers and to coordinate those programs. I think it's a little bit more, everyone is contributing a little bit.
Other questions or comments for Richard?
Hi, Richard, it's Brian.
Hi, Brian.
So I'm curious about that, the bark beetle area that you showed sort of early on, and the extent of disturbance that occurred with that. So it looked like basically the entirety of the forest has been wiped out. Well, you have a picture now, but it had occurred 20 years ago and it's regenerating. So I'm curious about what you know of like that regenerative process and whether or not there was a certain amount of assistance in terms of trying to restore it in a particular way, or whether it was just allowed to kind of come back with whatever would regrow there, or was it more directed? Because it's a pretty significant disturbance. And then additionally, like what has that meant across other areas of that ecosystem, particularly like soil health or water quality? Did you get any of the details on that kind of disturbance and then slow regrowth and restoration and possible consequences?
Okay, there are two elements. One thing I just got by chance because I was sitting in the same office. This person, he did a lot of research. He was in charge of all the hydrological studies and measurements. And he said, okay, after this, you had much higher concentrate of nitrate and what was it? Because of this dying forest. So you had, and this was some kind of like a tracer as well. So you had in the, because then, don't ask me, I'm not good at chemistry, but you had in the streams, you had a change chemistry due to this this dying forest. And the other thing is, I think that's exactly the philosophy of the park. They didn't do much. And this was exactly what the people didn't understand. So also they said, now, okay, they're dying, but cut them down. If you could at least sell the wood, why do you let them die and don't even use the wood? This wood is for them also was some money. But I think, look into history, it was in the 18th century or 19th century, there was the Bavarian crown. And for them, they really had the goal to make like a forest monoculture. So basically what's attacked by the bark beetle are spruce trees, and it's not a big problem if it's not ecologically, it's not a catastrophe if this more monocultural structure is destroyed by the bark beetle. And I think in this sense, they didn't do anything. They just did some public relation explaining to local population, look, this is no problem. This is a natural process. This is because you had a monoculture. If it would have been different. And now what you see is basically natural regeneration.
Great. Well, thank you. We have time for maybe one more question or comment if anybody would like to share. Okay. Well, Richard, thank you so much again for taking the time, and thank you, Brian Henkel, for making the connection here and introducing Richard and lining this up. It's a good presentation. It's great to hear about similar parks facing similar situations elsewhere in the world, and we've learned a lot. Just for everybody's reminder, this was recorded and the recording will be on the Schoodic Institute YouTube channel. And a heads up that our next brown bag, Acadia brown bag, is at this time of day, 12 noon, next Tuesday, the 19th, featuring Chrissy Murphy from the USGS co-op unit at the University of Maine. And she'll be talking about fish communities in Acadia's lakes. I'll send out a calendar note about that a little bit later today to the same list that received this one. So thank you everybody for your time and attention, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again,
Sure.
Richard.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.